How big a threat is ISIL to the Syrian regime? The armed group says it carried out coordinated attacks, killing dozens in southern Syria. As the army, backed by Russia and Iran, continues to crush the rebellion by the opposition, can ISIL be wiped out too? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. ISIL fighters have carried out their deadliest attacks for months in southwest Syria. Suicide bombers targeted a vegetable market, a hospital and a public square in the government-held city of al-Suwayda on Wednesday. Other gunmen raided nearby towns and villages. Dozens were killed, including pro-government fighters. Some activists and doctors say the number of fatalities is at least 240. Al-Suwayda, which is home to the Druze community, has mainly managed to avoid attacks during the conflict, which is now into its 7th year. Well, control of Syria is largely divided between four main players. In the northeast of the country, Kurdish groups control 1/3 of all territory and aim to establish their own autonomous government. To the west, Turkish-backed rebel forces control much of Idlib province and western Aleppo, home to around 3 million internally displaced Syrians. The Assad regime, backed by Iran and Russia, have regained control over the majority of Syria's provinces. ISIL's stronghold in southern Syria is under Russian and Syrian bombardment. After losing territory seized in both Syria and neighbouring Iraq, ISIL continues to control scattered patches of land. Regime forces are battling to regain control over the border with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. That's close to where ISIL launched suicide attacks on the city of al-Suwayda. Let's bring in our guests today here on Inside Story. Joining us from Vermont on Skype is Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In London, we have Haid, a Syria Consulting Research Fellow at Chatham House, and here in Doha, we're joined by Marwan Kabalan. He's a Syrian academic and writer. Welcome to you all. Marwan, in Doha, coming to you first. What we're talking about in Suwayda was a suicide mission. We haven't seen an ISIL suicide mission for many months. How significant is that?
I think it is important, in my opinion, but it doesn't represent an existential threat to the Syrian regime. I think ISIL now, as it loses more territories in Syria, whether in the southwest part of the country or even in the eastern part of the country, it will be actually resorting to the sort of tactics that was actually using in Iraq, especially during the U.S. occupation of that country. So most probably we are going to see more of these attacks, in fact. But as I said before, that is not going to be representing any existential threat for the Syrian regime, because ISIL is being actually confronted by most of the powers who are interested in the Syrian conflict. That would include the United States, Russia, Iran, the Sunni Arab countries, Turkey. So ISIL actually is almost fighting against everybody in this conflict. So there is no chance, in my opinion, for ISIL to pose this sort of existential threat for the Syrian regime. What we are going to see, as I said, is more of these attacks unless we have the sort of political solution to the Syrian crisis.
Understood. Haid in London. There was a particularly vicious element to what ISIL was doing with this suicide attack, because after the bombs went off, they were going round door to door, killing people in their own homes, but leaving one survivor. What's the message that ISIL is trying to get out now?
Well, it's not surprising to see or hear about this tactic, because from the beginning, ISIS has been trying to basically broadcast and amplify its brutality, and that is to mainly scare its enemies, but also to mobilize its allies and supporters around it. And what we saw in Suwayda is just another tactic that basically aims to make their attack to the headlines, and leaving survivors to tell the stories about what happened will make sure that Syrians and the rest of the world will continue to fear ISIS for years to come. And I think this is the main message.
And Joshua, what does this tell us about the preparedness of the Syrian forces?
Well, this is a classic ISIS attack. ISIS today is a cornered tiger. It's lashing out. There's a diversionary tactic to show that it's still lethal, even as it's being destroyed in southern Syria. So it attacked the Jebel Druze, and the Druze minority, of course, is seen as an evil minority by ISIS. Their 9th issue of their Dobbie magazine was about the Druze and how all their sheikhs, their religious leaders, should be killed. Their women could be sold into slavery like the Yazidis. So the Druze have long been a target for ISIS. It's a way to sow, in a sense, distrust between the Syrian regime and the Druze, because the Druze were very upset. They said, how come this could happen? How did you let them get here? Why did they massacre us? So there's a lot of internal squabbling. The Syrian opposition has blamed this on Assad and said that ISIS and Assad are one, that they're working together in a conspiracy to punish the Druze for not wholeheartedly being loyalists. This is seems to me rather a conspiracy theory, but it has sown dissension, and it's diverted the gaze from the real defeat that ISIS is undergoing today. It's nothing like it was 2 years ago when it had a big caliphate the size of Great Britain. And today its last little enclaves are being wiped out. But it's still a lethal force, and it can carry out these very dangerous attacks with a small number of men.
Haid, what does this attack by ISIL, the perpetrating of this attack by ISIL, tell us about those people who are perhaps rushing to judge and say Bashar al-Assad is actually very close to a complete victory?
Well, it shows two main issues. The first one is that the regime is still unable to secure the areas that it has been, with the support of its allies, able to capture so far. And the other thing is that the regime has been depending mainly on short-term strategy or tactics that lead to basically brutal results at a later stage, meaning that what Joshua was referring to here, why not only opposition groups but people from Suwayda themselves blamed Assad for, because most of the fighters who carried out the attack in Suwayda, people said that they came from the countryside of Damascus and from basically mainly from the refugee camp, Yarmouk camp in Damascus, where the regime brokered a deal with some ISIS fighters there and basically allowed them to be relocated to basically area that is close to Suwayda in the desert of eastern Syria. And this is why I think that the problem here is that Assad is moving basically one problem or solving one problem now, but creating 10 others later on. And the other issue I think that people are basically blaming Assad for, and the Russians as well, is that because recently there has been some Russian-led efforts to demobilize and disarm local militias in Suwayda. And after that, there were no measures taken by the regime or the Russians to protect those areas. And then after that, the ISIS fighters took advantage of that security vacuum and attack. And this is why also another reason for why people are blaming Assad and the Russians for it.
Marwan, coming back to you here in Doha, I mean, what are the chances here that Bashar al-Assad starts going after the Druze? Because the government forces don't control this specific area. That is obvious on the one hand. And on the other hand, the Druze, the young male Druze, do not sign up. They refuse to sign up to this quasi-conscription system that he's got going for the Syrian army.
Well, yes, indeed. I think the Druze are, in fact, in a very awkward position because, on the one hand, as you said, they are not trying, they are, in fact, trying actually not to be part of this war, which is waged by Assad against, I mean, the Sunni majority of Syrians. So they don't want to be part of that, on one hand. On the other hand, they are seen by ISIL as not truly Muslims. So they are, on one hand, attacked by ISIL. On the other hand, they are not very well protected by the Assad regime. And in fact, what the recent attack by ISIL demonstrates is that, as your other two guests actually have been suggesting, it shows that the Syrian regime is still, in fact, very vulnerable, very weak, and cannot provide the sort of protection that those people who are under his control actually are expecting him to provide. And this also demonstrates that military solution to this crisis will not actually end it. We still need to see a political solution, because unless we bring almost everybody on board in order to end this conflict, we are going to see, as we said earlier, more attacks by ISIL and more radicalization. Not only by ISIL, we are going to see more radicalization among the moderate Sunnis who have seen actually their houses destroyed, their brothers killed by this regime, and after all, the regime survived. And after all, the regime actually has retained most of the country. So I think it's really important here to see the sort of political solution to this conflict, despite the progress on the ground which has been made by the regime and its allies. So it's not the end yet. We are not there yet. I think the end will not be see it unless we see the sort of political solution that I was talking about earlier.
Joshua Landis in Vermont, if what we're talking about here with the Druze community is like a microcosm of the broader conflict, how does that mesh with where we are, the point that Marwan was making there, how does that mesh with where we are in the political arena? There are Kurds in Damascus having discussions with the Assad regime as we speak, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the reality is, what if ISIL is not defeated? What if ISIL is just regrouping and kind of returning to the gold standard of what it does? It's just regrouping.
Well, ISIS is regrouping, and it's attacked recently in Libya and Yemen and other places. But ISIS can only grow where there is a power vacuum. And quite clearly, ISIS spooked the United States, which was backing the Syrian rebels to destroy the Syrian government and the Syrian army under Assad. But America turned away from that support because it feared that ISIS or al-Qaeda would be the beneficiaries of this. So ultimately, the United States looked to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Russia and Assad in Syria to provide that security. And they've gone to the Kurds in the north. But ultimately, this is a dilemma, I think, that everybody has underlined here, is that we're going back to the status quo. Assad is clearly winning. He is asserting himself. He is destroying these various rebel groups, as he's been doing down in Daraa. The question is whether he can provide stable rule in Syria. And both your other commentators have said, no way, he can't do that unless he brings in more opposition. But that's very unlikely to happen. Assad is not going to find a political solution to this war. He's finding what he believes is a political solution, but one that will not satisfy most of the Syrian opposition. He is talking with the Kurds. And Marco Rubio, American senator, just accused the Kurds in North Syria, the YPG, of being a rebellious organization and in a sense of treason for talking with Assad. But the United States is not willing to really back them up. And that's the problem. What choice do these other groups have other than to fall in line with Assad? We've seen the Jordanians, we've seen the Lebanese, we've seen even the Israelis begin to talk about Assad staying and ultimately allowing the Syrian army into southern Syria, into the Daraa region, to destroy the rebels, and nobody lifted a finger to help them. So the writing is on the wall. Assad is winning, and the question is, how much stability can he bring back to Syria?
Hey, just put a couple of building blocks together here for us if we are talking about the beginning of the end of this conflict, and if it does mean indeed a victory for Bashar al-Assad. We've got the Kurds in Damascus. We've got the rescuers being rescued in the past few days, the white helmets being escorted to a different location. And we've got external actors kind of laying down a line in the sand saying, yes, we might accept an Assad victory, but we will not accept the consequences of that, i.e. millions of people displaced, unless those millions of people go back into Syria. How does that work?
Well, it's difficult to see basically a solution that will make everyone happy in a way. because on one hand, it's clear that, again, that the regime is winning militarily, but that doesn't automatically mean that basically the regime will be able to ensure, again, the stability of Syria on one hand, and stop the ongoing attacks inside Syria on the other hand, and more importantly for the regional and international actors, be able to allow or at least encourage refugees to go back. When we go to the first basically issue, which is will the Syrian regime be able to stop similar attacks in the future, we have ISIS who has been changing its tactics in order to ensure long-term survival. They have changed their economic model. They have changed basically their structure. They're depending mainly on sleeper cells and people who are discreetly trying to destabilize different areas. You have other rebel groups who will continue to carry out similar guerrilla-like guerrilla warfare-like attacks in different areas. And then you have political solution that will, again, will not most likely happen unless we see some serious pressure from Russia on the regime, because the regime wants to basically recapture the rest of Syria militarily, but the Russians so far are not willing or unable to pressure the regime to accept some kind of compromise with the rest of the groups. And when it comes to basically, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where basically the regime will continue to function in different areas or in the majority of Syria, but groups will continue to carry out attacks. Area will be destabilized, and many refugees will not be able to go back. So it will be a failed or semi-failed state that we will be most likely looking at in the future.
Marwan, if there's another al-Suwayda, could that knock off course the diplomacy that clicks together with the politics, in as much as, for example, we know for a fact French diplomats have been ping-ponging between Beirut and Damascus for the last year. The French, under Russian auspices, are getting aid into that western half of Syria, and yet the French are being criticized for saying, well, for doing that, because people are saying, well, hang on, if you're working with the Russians, you're backing the Russians. If you're backing the Russians, you're backing Bashar al-Assad. So there seems to be a circle there that has got to be squared, but how do you square it?
Well, Peter, I mean, this is the point that I was trying actually to make. Even if Assad is winning on the ground in Syria, I think there are so many stakeholders in this conflict. Most of them would perhaps now accept that Assad is winning, including the United States, Israel, the Arab Gulf states, and others. But I think there is a big elephant in the room that we need all to see it before we can talk about an end also, I mean, to this conflict, apart from seeing a political solution between the regime and the opposition, which is Iran in this case. I think everybody is talking now about how to get Iran out of Syria if we accept Assad remaining in power for the next couple of years. I mean, this is something that is really important. So now, I mean, I believe this is why in Syria it's really important to get almost everybody on board. That means the Russians, the Americans. Of course, I mean, the Russians are having the upper hand in the Syrian conflict. They are in the driving seat. The Americans might be in the back seat for the time being, but we need the people who are sitting in the back seat and the people who are sitting in the driving seat to come to agree actually on how to drive the vehicle, in this case, I mean, political solution in Syria. So I think we need to bring almost everybody right now in order to have a political solution to this crisis in Syria. As far as the French role is concerned, I think this is somehow an interpretation of the Helsinki summit between President Putin and President Trump. The focus right now is maybe on the Syrian refugees, on trying to focus maybe on the humanitarian aspect of the Syrian crisis, because political solution right now doesn't seem very likely, as I said, because we need to have almost everybody on board. This is why with the French, actually, we have seen the French stepping in and trying to do something with the Russians, because they know for now that this is perhaps the issue that need to be to be dealt with for the time being, until we see an agreement between the Americans and the Russians on how to deal with Iran. Also, the Israelis will be actually have a say in this.
Let's just pick up on that point of Iran that you're raising and throw that to Joshua. Joshua, but there has been slight progress on that because the Israelis surely have got exactly what they wanted, because they've got Russian guarantees from the Iranians saying, yes, we will move back from where we were historically over the past several months, because the Israelis were beginning to get really uncomfortable with that.
I don't think there's a chance in hell of getting the Iranians out of Syria. President Assad has made it very clear that he has invited the Iranians in, and he expects them to stay. Now, did Israel get what it wants? I don't think it did. Israel is busy drawing red lines by bombing everything in Syria that it can find of Iran's. But the Israeli demands were made to Lavrov in a meeting just a few days ago, and they want the border with Lebanon closed, so there's no rearming of Hezbollah. They want Iran out, no missile emplacements. Their list is very long, very extensive, and they're not going to get it. So they're going to continue to bomb, and as we've seen them do up near Aleppo, any place they can sense that there are Iranian soldiers helping out, advising, or helping to build missiles, they will blow up. And that's, they're taking care of their security and drawing red lines. But I don't suspect that Iran is going to leave. And Russia will not make Iran leave. Russia needs Iran in the sense that they have won together. And they are both interested in propping up the Assad regime. The moment Iran leaves Syria, the country will be very vulnerable. And we've seen that in Iraq too. We've seen that with Hezbollah. Iran has a major investment, and it has won. It believes it has won.
Okay. Let's just put one more point, just to interrupt you, Joshua, because we are trotting towards the end of the program. Haid, the Russians are saying we will give all those displaced people safe passage. Safe passage to where and to what? Vladimir Putin is not going to put 1 million people into Chechnya, into the Caucasus. If he starts moving them around, Mr. Erdogan in Ankara will react very badly. Turkey has got literally a footprint on Syrian soil. It is semi-permanent. Presumably he wants to stay. Where do those people go, and what kind of life do they have once they get there?
Well, so far, according to the Russian statement, they want them to go back to their own, basically, areas. But here we have two issues. The first one is that the Syrian regime has been systematically trying to prevent many people to go back to their areas, mainly around rural Damascus and basically the border with Lebanon. For example, you have Daraya, which has been captured for more than 2 years. It's completely empty, and many other towns are completely empty. So the Russians cannot basically pressure the regime to allow those people to go back to their areas. So if many of them cannot go back to their areas, then they will be displaced elsewhere, and that's something that people are not willing to basically risk their lives for. And the other thing is that basically many of those people, they still have many concerns that are not basically addressed. One of the issues is that all those who are considered basically opponents to the regime, there's no protection guarantees. Those who are basically wanted to do their military service and who are scared of being enlisted, there is no guarantee that they will not be enlisted. And this is why, unless those different issues are addressed, you will find it difficult to see people voluntarily go. The alternative will be to force those people to go back from the region, and then that will have many other consequences that will lead to destabilizing the regions that they live in, because they will not be happy.
Marwan, the last point of the program to you, please. Is this the beginning of the end game of the war in Syria, or if there's another al-Suwayda, is that a perfect demonstration of the fact that this war is far from over and it will continue apace for many months to come?
We said during the program that the Assad regime might be winning militarily on the ground, but I think there will be no stability in Syria unless we have a political solution to this crisis, including actually the discussion about Iran. I think Russia's need for Iran will decrease when this conflict ends militarily. And there will be no need for Iran to stay in Syria if we have a political solution, because there will be no threat to the regime at that point. If we have the opposition and the regime agreeing on a political solution, what threat would be posed against the regime in this case? So Iran should be actually leaving Syria. Without Iran leaving Syria, I cannot see real solution to this conflict in Syria.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks for your contribution. Thank you to our guests, Marwan Kabalan, Joshua Landis and Haid. And thank you too for your company. You can see the show again anytime by checking out the website, aljazeera.com, or for further discussion, check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us at AJ Inside Story, or tweet me, I'll tweet you back. I'm at Peter Dobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the entire team here in Doha. Thanks for your company. We'll do it all again at the same time tomorrow. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.